In the heart of Hollywood, Los Angeles, there's a house that's seen more than just its share of fame, it's seen terror, too. Known for its sleek, modern style and breathtaking views of the city, Ashton Kutcher and Demi Moore's former residence is more than just a celebrity mansion. It is a place where strange, unexplained events have left even the most skeptical shaking their heads. It started with small things. The faint sound of footsteps echoing through empty halls. The creak of a door opening in the dead of night when no one was there. At first, Ashton and Demi dismissed it as the usual quirks of an old house. But then the incidents began to escalate. One night, as the couple sat in the living room, Demi froze mid-conversation. She had heard it again, the unmistakable sound of someone whispering her name. Demi, the voice was soft, almost melodic, but there was a dark edge to it. She looked to Ashton, but he hadn't heard anything. The house, for all its grandeur, suddenly felt cold and hollow, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The unsettling experiences only deepened when Demi was alone in the house. She was in the kitchen, preparing dinner when she felt a sudden chill. A shadow moved in the corner of her eye, but when she turned to look, there was nothing. Yet, the air around her grew heavier, like a presence was watching her. She quickly brushed it off, but then it happened. Her reflection in the kitchen window wasn't hers. The face staring back at her was pale, with hollow eyes and a look of despair. The woman in the glass was not her. Panicked, Demi spun around to find no one there. She stared back at her own reflection, now normal, but the eerie sensation of being watched lingered. One night, Demi claimed to have seen something even more chilling. She was drifting off to sleep when she saw a figure standing at the foot of her bed. A woman pale, with long dark hair that cascaded around her face. The woman's eyes were locked onto Demi's, but her expression was empty, lifeless. The figure slowly lifted a hand, as if to touch her, but Demi screamed, and the figure vanished into thin air. Ashton, always the skeptic, tried to comfort her, but the strange occurrences never stopped. The sounds continued: footsteps in the attic, doors slamming when no one was around, and whispers that seemed to follow them through every room. Despite hiring a team of paranormal investigators, no explanation was ever found. The house was thoroughly searched, yet nothing seemed to tie the terrifying events to the building's history. But as the couple moved out, leaving the house behind, the strange occurrences didn't. The new tenants reported hearing the same eerie whispers, feeling a cold presence near the stairwell, and seeing a ghostly figure in the reflection of the kitchen window. It was as if the house itself was alive with something dark, and no one could escape it. As the years passed, the house on the hill became known among locals as the haunted Kutcher mansion. Even now, if you listen closely while walking past, you might hear the faint whisper of a woman's voice calling out from the shadows. No one can say for sure who she is, but one thing is clear: she's not gone, and she's not alone. The house stands empty now, abandoned by those who dared to call it home. But the restless spirit of the woman in the kitchen window lingers, waiting for the next soul to cross her path. And if you're brave enough to step inside, you might just hear her whisper your name, too. The house had been vacant for nearly 6 months when a new family decided to move in. The Johnsons, eager to escape the chaos of the city, had heard rumors about the mansion's eerie history, but dismissed them as nothing more than gossip. They thought the sprawling property, with its panoramic views and quiet surroundings, would be the perfect place to start fresh. From the very first night, something felt off. The moment the family crossed the threshold, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The air was thick with an almost suffocating stillness, as though the house was holding its breath. The Johnsons attributed it to the house's age, but the uneasy feeling only grew stronger as the days wore on. It began with the mirrors. In the hallway, there was an old, ornate mirror, one of the few pieces the previous owners had left behind. Every time someone passed by it, they felt a strange sense of dread, like the reflection wasn't their own. It wasn't uncommon for the family to glance at their own image and find it momentarily distorted, like shadows dancing just out of sight. One evening, Mrs. Johnson went to check on her children after hearing a strange noise from upstairs. The air on the second floor was colder than it had been downstairs, and the hall light flickered erratically. She pushed open her daughter's bedroom door and froze. Her daughter, Emma, was standing perfectly still in front of the mirror. But her reflection was not. It was a woman tall, with long dark hair, dressed in something that looked like an old-fashioned nightgown, her face expressionless. The reflection seemed to move, slowly, lifting a hand to gently touch Emma's shoulder. Terrified, Mrs. Johnson rushed to her daughter. But when she turned Emma around, there was no one else in the room. The mirror reflected only the two of them, as if nothing had happened. "Mom, who's that woman?" Emma asked quietly, her voice trembling. Before Mrs. Johnson could respond, the door behind them slammed shut, sending them both into a panic. They could hear the faint sound of footsteps, like someone was pacing just outside the room. The pressure in the air grew thick and suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in. The next morning, Mr. Johnson, determined to put his wife's fears to rest, decided to take a closer look at the house's history. After all, the rumors were just that, rumors. But what he found was unsettling. He visited the local library and combed through archives of the neighborhood, eventually stumbling upon an old, yellowed newspaper article dating back to the early 1900s. The article detailed the mysterious disappearance of a woman named Margaret Davenport, a former resident of the very house the Johnsons now occupied. According to the report, Margaret had been a singer at a local theater, known for her beauty and haunting voice. But one fateful night, she vanished without a trace. Some claimed she'd fallen in love with a man who wasn't what he seemed. Others believed she was the victim of a botched performance that had led to her tragic end. The article didn't provide many answers, but one thing was clear. The house had a dark past, one tied to a woman who had never truly left. Mr. Johnson couldn't shake the feeling that he had uncovered something far worse than he'd expected. That night, after returning home, he decided to investigate the attic. It was the one place in the house they hadn't explored. As he climbed the creaky stairs, a chill ran down his spine, and the faint smell of Jasmine, Margaret's favorite flower, hit him. Inside the attic, dust and cobwebs filled the air. But something else was there too. A sound. The soft, rhythmic scratching of nails on wood. He turned toward the source of the noise, but the room was empty. The attic was cramped, and the only thing out of place was a small, old trunk shoved in the corner. Curiosity getting the better of him, he approached the trunk and opened it. Inside, he found an assortment of old clothes, faded photographs, and a tattered, leather-bound book. As he flipped through the pages, the words seemed to swim before his eyes, detailed accounts of a woman's descent into madness. Margaret's handwriting filled the pages, speaking of voices that called to her from the walls, of someone or something whispering her name. It became clear that Margaret had known she was never truly alone in the house. Suddenly, the attic door slammed shut, the lock clicking into place with an unnatural force. Mr. Johnson's heart raced as he scrambled to open it, but the door wouldn't budge. In the darkness, the sound of scratching grew louder, now coming from all sides. The air was thick, suffocating. And then, in the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure, pale, gaunt, with long dark hair. She was standing in the corner of the attic, her eyes locked onto his. "Margaret," and in a voice that echoed through the walls, she whispered, "You're next." Mr. Johnson's breath caught in his throat as the house around him seemed to close in. The scratching intensified, the air turned frigid, and for a moment, it felt as though the very foundation of the house was shaking. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, staring at Margaret's ghost, but suddenly, the door flew open. Without thinking, he bolted out of the attic, down the stairs, and out of the house. He didn't return. The Johnsons left the house the very next day. But Margaret remained. Her whispers lingered, carried on the wind, and the house stood empty once more. As the mansion sat in the growing darkness of the Hollywood Hills, the question still remained. Who was the next person to answer Margaret's call? Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The house remained abandoned for weeks, the dark rumors surrounding it now impossible to ignore. For a while, it seemed like the mansion had finally given up its grip on the living, but the truth was far from that. The whispers never stopped. They didn't just echo from the walls, they seemed to grow louder, closer, as if the house itself were searching for someone. One particularly stormy evening, a young couple, Brad and Sarah, moved in. They had heard the stories, of course, but they were both avid fans of the paranormal. Skeptics at heart, they saw this as an opportunity to test their beliefs and possibly even document evidence for their growing YouTube channel, which focused on paranormal investigations. They were excited about the challenge. How many people could claim to have lived in the haunted Kutcher mansion, after all? The first night in the house was uneventful, or so it seemed. The wind howled through the trees outside, and the rain battered the windows. Inside, the couple was cozying up, setting up cameras, and discussing their plans to explore the house the next day. But as they settled into bed, Sarah began to feel an uneasy sensation creeping up her spine. "Brad, do you feel that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Brad, who had been focused on his phone, didn't look up. "Feel what?" "The air. It's different," she said, sitting up and looking around the room. "Like it's alive." Brad rolled his eyes. "Come on, Sarah. You're just being paranoid. It's the storm, that's all." But Sarah's discomfort only grew. She could feel that something was watching her, waiting. As she turned her head toward the doorway, she saw the faintest outline of a figure standing just beyond the threshold. It was barely visible in the dim light, but its presence sent a cold chill racing down her spine. "Brad," she whispered urgently, her voice shaking. "There's someone in the hallway." Brad looked up this time, his brow furrowing. "Sarah, there's no one there." But as he stood up and walked over to the door to check, Sarah could see the figure more clearly, now a woman. Her long dark hair hanging in tangled strands, her face obscured by shadows. She was staring at them, unmoving, and yet Sarah could feel the weight of her gaze pressing against her chest. Suddenly, Brad froze, his face drained of color. "Sarah, I can't explain this, but..." Before he could finish, the figure vanished. Just like that, in the blink of an eye, she was gone. But the room grew colder, and the oppressive silence that followed was worse than any sound. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Later that night, as they tried to sleep, Brad heard something he couldn't ignore. A faint scratching sound. At first, he thought it was just the wind or an animal outside, but the sound was coming from inside the walls. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like nails dragged slowly across the drywall. And it was getting louder. "Sarah," he whispered, shaking her awake. "Listen to that." Sarah's eyes widened in terror as the noise grew louder and faster, as if something or someone was trying to claw its way out from the inside. The sound was joined by soft, echoing whispers, so faint at first that they seemed like the wind. But the words began to take shape. "Help me, let me out, Brad, Sarah." The voices were low and guttural, like they were coming from deep within the earth. And then, Sarah heard it, a single word, clear as Dave, "Margaret." The room grew colder, and the whispers stopped abruptly. An unnatural silence filled the air, but it didn't last. A sudden crash came from upstairs, followed by heavy footsteps, like someone or something was pacing the hall. "Stay here," Brad whispered, his voice tight with fear. "I'm going to check it out." "No, Brad. Please," Sarah begged, her voice trembling. "Don't leave me alone." But it was too late. Brad had already moved toward the door. Sarah's heart raced as she watched him disappear into the hallway. She sat frozen in bed, trying to convince herself that it was just the house settling, that there was no such thing as ghosts. But the weight of the atmosphere pressed down on her chest. The minutes stretched into eternity. She couldn't hear Brad's footsteps anymore. The silence was unbearable. Suddenly, the door to their bedroom slammed open with such force that it shook the walls. Sarah screamed, but the figure standing in the doorway wasn't Brad. It was Margaret. The woman stood tall, her long, dark hair tangled and wild, her face pale, with eyes that were black as coal. She was wearing the same nightgown that Sarah had seen in the reflection, tattered, dirty, as though she had been wandering for years. But it wasn't just her appearance that terrified Sarah, it was the chilling, hollow expression on her face, as though Margaret had lost all connection to the living world. "Help me," Margaret whispered, her voice hoarse, strained. But Sarah was frozen in place. She couldn't speak, couldn't move. Margaret stepped closer, her feet never touching the floor, as though she was gliding on air. The temperature in the room plummeted, and a dense fog began to creep in from the edges of the room, swirling around Margaret's figure. "Who are you?" Sarah finally found her voice, but it trembled with fear. The ghost didn't answer. Instead, she reached out a hand, her long fingers curling towards Sarah's throat. Sarah gasped, backing away as far as she could in the bed, but the figure kept advancing. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, Margaret stopped. She stood motionless for a moment, her black eyes staring directly into Sarah's soul. Then, without a sound, she turned and vanished through the door, as if she had never been there at all. Brad, still shaken, re-entered the room a moment later, his face pale. He had found nothing upstairs. "Sarah, are you okay? What happened?" Sarah didn't answer. She was too terrified to speak. As the minutes ticked by, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was still in the house with them. And in the distance, faint but unmistakable, the scratching started again. Only this time it was louder, closer. The house was not done with them yet. The scratching grew louder, reverberating through the walls, as if something or someone was trying to break free. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, and she could feel the air around her thickening with an unnatural heaviness. Brad, too, was visibly shaken, his face pale under the dim light. "What the hell is going on, Sarah?" he whispered, his voice cracking with fear. Sarah could barely form words. The figure of Margaret had vanished, but the terror had not. The house had become a living nightmare. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside, felt like an omen. The whispering, the scraping, the chilling air, it was all too much. "We need to leave," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "We need to get out of here. Now." Brad hesitated for a moment, but the fear in Sarah's eyes was enough to make him act. He grabbed his phone, dialing the number for a moving company, but it was too late. The door to the bedroom slammed shut with a force that rattled the windows. Brad turned, his eyes wide with panic, but before he could speak, the room went completely dark. The light bulbs above them flickered, then died. "Brad!" Sarah screamed. Then the whispering started again. This time it was different. The voices weren't coming from the walls, they were coming from inside the room, all around them. Soft, breathy whispers filled the air, like the very house was speaking to them. "I never left. I'm still here," the voices chanted in unison. Sarah looked around, her breath coming in quick gasps. The room was completely still, yet every corner seemed to pulse with energy, like the house itself was alive. The door was locked, the windows were shut tight, and then, just as suddenly as the whispers had begun, they stopped. An eerie silence fell over the room, so profound it felt suffocating. Sarah dared to look at Brad. His face was ashen, his eyes wide with terror. What is happening?" he gasped, his voice trembling. Before she could respond, the temperature in the room dropped rapidly. Frost appeared on the edges of the windows, and their breath began to mist in the air. The scratching, that relentless, bone-chilling sound, started again, this time from directly behind them. Sarah turned slowly. There, standing just inches away, was Margaret. Her black eyes glowed faintly in the dark. Her thin lips twisted into a cruel smile. She stepped forward, her figure shimmering in and out of focus like a mirage. "You wanted to leave, but it's too late," Margaret's voice rasped. It was cold, hollow, empty. "You're mine now." The temperature dropped even further. Sarah felt as though the very air was being sucked out of her lungs. She stumbled back, but Margaret's presence was everywhere, surrounding them. Brad took a step forward, attempting to push past Margaret. "Get away from us," he shouted. But as soon as he touched her, his hand went straight through her, as if she were made of smoke. A burst of icy cold rushed through his arm, and he recoiled in horror. "She's not real," he gasped, his voice cracking with fear. "This is all in our heads." "No, Brad," Sarah whispered, her eyes never leaving Margaret. "She's real. And she's never leaving. Margaret tilted her head slightly, as if amused. Her hollow eyes locked onto Sarah's, and for a moment, the room seemed to distort, the walls pressing inward. "You can't escape me," Margaret's voice echoed, louder now, a deafening scream filling their ears. "This house is mine. And now so are you." Sarah's head spun. She could feel the floor beneath her shifting, the walls closing in. The whispers filled her mind, overwhelming her with thoughts of despair, of hopelessness. She looked at Brad, but his face was blank, his eyes wide and unblinking. He was staring at someone behind her. Her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't Margaret. It was something worse. A figure tall, thin, and shrouded in shadows loomed behind her. She could feel its presence without looking. It was the source of the whispers. The figure's eyes were hollow, its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, and as it stepped forward, the room seemed to buckle under its weight. The floor groaned. "Run, Sarah!" Brad shouted, his voice breaking as he pulled at her arm. But before they could move, the figure reached out, its fingers cold as ice, and touched Sarah's shoulder. The moment it made contact, the world around them shattered. The walls crumbled. The room seemed to spin and twist like a storm, the air thick with cold, dark energy. When Sarah opened her eyes, she was no longer in the house. She stood in the middle of a desolate, barren landscape, dark clouds swirling overhead, a suffocating silence that made her ears ring. The mansion was gone. Brad was gone. The only thing that remained was the oppressive feeling of being watched. The figure loomed before her, its grin growing wider. "You wanted to leave," it whispered. "But this is your new home." And as Sarah stood frozen, the whispers began again, louder, closer, until they surrounded her, echoing in her mind. "You're mine now." Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Any coincidences with real events or characters are accidental.